And hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we are taking a look at the RTX 3080 10 gigs, which in a few months will be 4 years old. Yep, that sure went by quickly. So let's see how it performs nowadays. Let's go. So, the RTX 3080 10GB is a pretty special card, since it was both one of the best deals from Nvidia in recent years, and there is unfortunately little chance that we will see this kind of product again on the market. And this pretty good deal was also spoiled quite quickly with everything we experienced with GPU shortage due to crypto mining in 2021, and absolutely crazy price, which make current GPU prices look like very awesome deals nowadays. Since at the worst of the crypto mining bubble, the 3080 was selling for around 2,000 euros for one card that was sold at an official MSRP of 730 euros. So what made the 3080 interesting? Well, we were at the end of the RTX 20 generation, which, a bit like the current RTX 40s, wasn't the most exciting since it was the first generation of cards with ray tracing and DLSS. And the first games with those technologies didn't particularly impress. We remember Battlefield 5 and its ray tracing, which made the game look worse while destroying performance, and DLSS upscaling in its first iteration was far from what it became nowadays. And on top of that, the RTX 20 generation came along with a fairly steep price increase. If you remember, the 2080 was released with an official price of $700, while we could still find the GTX 1080 Ti on the market with close enough performances in the games of that era, and it was cheaper. On top of that, the 1080 Ti had 11 gigs of VRAM while the 2080 had 8. So as a potential buyer at the time, the 1080 Ti was a much better deal, especially since the 2080 Ti, which was the only card that was really more powerful than the 1080 Ti, also had a sharp increase in price at over 1,000 USD. So yes, the RTX 20 generation, as I often say, was quite similar to the RTX 40 generation in quite a few ways, and back then we were all waiting to see what would happen for the RTX 30 generation, just like we kind of wonder what will happen with the RTX 50s in a few months. And for this RTX 30 generation, Nvidia had made a fairly interesting move to lower production cost, since they had chose to change foundries to manufacture their consumer chips. The RTX 30 were manufactured by Samsung, while in the past Nvidia had been producing their chips at TSMC most of the time, and the Samsung 8N that was used had a big cost advantage over the TSMC 7N. On the other hand, Samsung's process had several issues: lower energy efficiency than TSMC's 7N, and also lower yields, but as far as yields are concerned, I would say that it's mainly an issue for Samsung and Nvidia more than the customers. So yes, the RTX 30 on the high end ended up being very power hungry, and it was one of the first times where we had gone above the 300 watts consumption mark for general consumer cards, if we exclude multi-GPU cards before. And what made the 3080 quite special was that the contrast with the 20 generation was very obvious. While the 2080 had difficulty reaching the performance level of the 1080 Ti while costing $100 more than the 1080 when it was released, the 3080 was around 30% more powerful than the 2080 Ti while keeping the same MSRP as the 2080, and compared to the 2080 and 1080 Ti, it was around 60 to 70% more powerful. The only issue with the 3080, as with a couple of other RTX 30 cards, was the VRAM amount, since the 3080 came up with 10 gigs of VRAM due to its 320-bit memory bus. It was therefore either 10 gigs or 20 gigs, but we will come back to that later. So, in the context of its release, while 10 gigs of VRAM was clearly not a generous amount for the games back then, it was enough. Let's not forget that more than 3 years ago now, we were at the end of the PS4 and Xbox One generation. The PS5 and Xbox Series arrived at about the same time as the RTX 30s, and the games that required more than 8 gigs of VRAM could be counted on the fingers of half a hand, and it took about another year for games to need more VRAM more often. But still, 10 gigs seemed to be a surprising choice, but in the end it can be explained quite easily. The 3080 used the same chip as the 3090, the GA102, and to mark a big difference in performance, Nvidia chose to both cut the numbers of CUDA cores along with a big slash on the memory bus width, which went from a 384 to a 320-bit bus, and that's where the major difference is between the two cards. A 384-bit bus made it so the 3090 could get 24 gigs of VRAM, which was a big enough difference from the 10 gigs of the 3080, thus enabling 1,500 MSRP for the 3090. Otherwise, just from a gaming performance point of view, both cards are really not that far apart. The 3090 is only about 15 to 20% more powerful than the 3080 for twice the price. But that's without taking into account that, according to certain rumors at the time, we should have got some other variant of the 3080 and 3070, since slides from certain partners were leaked and the 3080 20GB and 3070 16GB seemed to be planned for release later on. Since AMD's RDNA 2 was also coming up, and on those cards VRAM levels were much higher, the 6800 XT excluding ray tracing was very close to the 3080 in raster performance, but cheaper and with 16 gigs of VRAM, and the 6700 XT, which was to come up later, was going to have 12 gigs of VRAM instead of 8 for the 3070. And so it didn't seem illogical, if we think of the market of that time, that Nvidia would add more SKUs to the lineup with more VRAM at some point, likely for a higher price. A bit like the super range for the RTX 20 and 40 are most likely just lineup and price adjustments that we didn't get for the RTX 30 generation. Why were these models never released? Well, crypto mining, quite simply. Given that all the cards with more than 8 gigs of VRAM were selling like pancakes, even at absolutely high price, why would you put double the VRAM on one card for $50 or $100 more when you can make two wall cards with the same amount of VRAM that will sell for stupid prices anyway? Releasing new SKUs with more VRAM just didn't make sense from a pure business point of view at that time, and I will always wonder what would have become of that generation of cards if crypto mining had not come to disrupt the market as strongly as it did. I think it would have been much different then, and the actual generation would have likely been pretty different too. But anyway, that's for the historical side of this card, but what interests us today is how does the 3080 look like 3.5 years later in games? Was the 3080 really a good deal or not? We are going to take a look on most recent games and on certain games with known VRAM issues for cards with 8GB and see how the 3080 behaves. Because what made me want to do this video at first are mostly comments that I often see online about this card lately, and also the comments about 12 gigs card most of the time, since according to some people, cards with less than 16 gigs of VRAM may as well be all thrown to the bin, and that within 2 years all this card will be unusable for a reason which is unknown, aside from a vague assumption that the demand for VRAM will increase sharply all of a sudden, although I don't really see why it would. So to observe this, we will take a look at what it looks like in video, both at 1440p and 4K, maximum details with RT when there is any, or not, upscaling as well. I would also like to remind you that not all scenarios can be tested. A lack of VRAM can manifest itself directly when we saturate it. Sometimes it's elements in the game or textures which will not display properly. We can also have VRAM getting filled up over time while playing a game to end up saturating only after a couple of hours. Sometimes changing the graphics setting without restarting the game can also saturate the VRAM. And there are also scenarios where we are just borderline with small stutters or hiccups from time to time, which will be imperceptible for some people and for others very annoying. So yeah, we can't really test everything right here, sadly. But anyway, let's get to it, starting with Alan Wake 2, one of the most demanding games currently. Max raster details here. We see some drops on the 1%, be it at 1440p or 4K. The frame time is not super stable, and at 1440p I don't believe that we are saturating the VRAM here, and at 4K it seems borderline, but it looks okay on this scene. Not sure if that would be the case everywhere in the game, but what's clear is that the game is super demanding. At 4K native, it is difficult to maintain 30 FPS average for the 3080 here. But if we activate DLSS in balance mode, we obtain more stable and fluid gameplay with an average of 72 FPS, but personally, I would still aim for medium details on this title, which do not change much on screen, and it would keep us from framerate dipping below 60. If we also activate ray tracing eye settings, which is path tracing, unsurprisingly, the 3080 is struggling. We cannot achieve 30 FPS at 1440p, and at 4K, we are below 20 FPS average. Quite an extreme situation here. However, VRAM-wise, the game don't seem to manage too badly. We know that it certainly could eat more than 10 gigs in these conditions, but the gameplay do not turn into a slideshow here, but it is clearly not playable regardless, but that would probably not be the case either, even if the card had 16 gigs of VRAM. Activating DLSS in quality mode at 1440p makes it playable, even if we are below 60 FPS on average, and at 4K, with DLSS balanced mode, we are around 30 FPS on average, which I think remains quite honorable for the 3080 here, but to my taste at 4K, I would just play without RT and with DLSS for a 60 FPS experience. But if you are fine with lower frame rate, I guess you can push settings a bit more here. So is the VRAM an issue in this game? We are kinda borderline, I think, but the real issue is more that the raw performances of the card aren't enough for a 4K native experience. We will have to make compromises, 10 gigs or not. Whatever happens at 4K in this game, any cards with similar performances will have to turn some settings down. For Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, another very demanding game, since the game uses ray tracing software akin to Lumen by default, at ultra settings, whether at 1440p or 4K, we are not really comfortable in the EVS segments. We are close to 60 FPS average at 1440p, but not holding them, and at 4K, it is difficult to maintain 30 FPS average. So here as well we will have to make concessions, but VRAM does not seem to be an issue in this game. At ultra settings with upscaling, it's clearly going better, even if the game remains very demanding, but we are now above 60 FPS average at 1440p DLSS quality, and not far from 60 for 4K DLSS balance, which is playable. But let's see what it looks like in eye details now. So, with eye settings native, we are well above at what we had at ultra settings with 30% more performance at 1440p and almost 40% more performance at 4K. And in terms of visuals between eye and ultra settings, it really doesn't change all that much, as it often is the case, but we are still not at a constant 60 FPS at 4K. However, at 1440p, it works well enough. So with upscaling on top, we almost reach a constant 60 FPS at 4K, but we are not completely there, since the 1% at around 50, so we will see some dips below 60 FPS here and there. And at 1440p DLSS quality, 103 FPS on average and 77 on the 1%, it's not bad. For such a demanding game, this is probably what I would choose to use settings-wise. So once again, I won't say that we are comfortable VRAM-wise, but no huge stutters or massive improvements to expect if we had more VRAM here. The game is just super demanding and we don't have much choice but to make compromises and lower settings to make it run at 60 FPS at 4K. Baldurs Gate 3 now. At ultra settings in the third act, we are good at 1440p with more than 100 FPS on average, and not far from 70 at 4K. On the other hand, the game has significant drops in frame rate, and that's not due to the VRAM here. We are CPU bound here in this part of the game. But still, at 1440p or 4K, the game will run fine and no VRAM issues here. Cyberpunk 2077 in the Phantom Liberty expansion, at ultra rasterization settings, it's still a super demanding game. We are just above the 60 FPS average at 1440p, and at 4K we are around 30 FPS on average. No worries as far as VRAM goes through, the game is just really heavy. Ultra settings with DLSS now, at 1440p DLSS quality, we are close to 90 FPS average, which is plenty enough playable, and at 4K we are still not reaching 60 FPS average, but we are getting close. So yeah, even without ray tracing, the ultra settings in this game are really demanding. So let's see what we get with eye details rasterization. Well, as we can see here, we gain a lot of performances, 30% more at 1440p and 37 at 4K. We almost achieve the performances we had at ultra settings with upscaling. So it's roughly the same type of gains as we had with Avatar between ultra and eye settings. And once again, visually speaking, it really doesn't change all that much. So as often, looking for ultra settings at all costs is just making things difficult for your hardware for little visual gains. And if we now activate DLSS at eye settings, we get around 120 FPS average at 1440p and around 80 at 4K, very usable on the ball. RT Ultra now, well, without upscaling, it's a bloodbath, 34 FPS at 1440p and 7 at 4K. And yes, we clearly have a VRAM issue here at 4K. We see big stutters, which clearly indicates that we are lacking in VRAM here. So yes, VRAM is limiting performances here, but even if we had 16 gigs of VRAM, we would still get 10 or maybe 15 FPS average. So regardless, we would have to lower settings because it wouldn't be playable either. With DLSS, it works better, no surprise here, 60 average at 1440p, DLSS quality, and 48 at 4K DLSS balanced, and here, the upscaling upscale helps with the VRAM issues, which is good, but that doesn't mean it will be perfect at all time. We are borderline here, and to reach 60 FPS at 4K upscaled, we will still have to lower the settings even more. So yes, with extreme settings in this game, 10GB isn't enough, but it would be just as unplayable even with more VRAM, without lowering settings anyway. Moving on to Dragon's Dogma 2, highest preset goes pretty smoothly at 1440p. At 4K on the other hand, we are a little too close to the 60 FPS mark for my taste, so I will adjust settings a bit more to get something a bit higher FPS wise. Ray tracing on this title, we know that it's not all that demanding, we lose a few FPS on average, it does not change the situation much, and activating upscaling does not really have a big impact on performances either. But well, Dragon's Dogma 2 is still a bit rough around the edges as far as optimization goes, but here it's playable and no worries as far as VRAM goes. F1 2023, ultra settings, we see that at 1440p, no problem, stable performances, more than 150 FPS on average at 4K, so even if the average FPS are quite high, we note drops on the 1% on a regular basis. Is it because of the VRAM? I'm not sure. It's the first time I am testing F1 2023, and even if the VRAM usage is quite high at 4K, we don't see huge stutters or drops in FPS, just a frame rate that is not always super stable. If we activate ray tracing now, performances collapses as usual at 1440p. Well, it's a bit like at 4K Ultra Raster, no huge stutters, but regular small drops on the 1%, but VRAM does not seem to be a problem, and at 4K the frame rate is not rock stable either. With upscaling, we see better performances with more than 100 FPS at 1440p and close to 80 on average at 4K, but the frame rate remains quite unstable, especially at the beginning of the race. So I don't get the feeling that the 10 gigs of VRAM are an issue here, and it's one of those games where ray tracing doesn't bring anything amazing to the game anyway, so you might as well play without it. Hogwarts Legacy now. So, it's a problematic game, as we know. Performances has always been very unstable on this title, and with 8 gigs of VRAM, depending on the settings, the title can suffer on performances, or textures not loading up, and at ultra settings without RT, well, it works. No VRAM problem here. Game is heavy, but it works, even if personally I would still lower to high settings. The 1% are clearly low, but it's the same with every GPUs. It's not a problem with the 3080, it's an issue with the game itself. When we activate ultra ray tracing, we run into problems now, especially at 4K. We are clearly lacking VRAM wise, and we can see huge regular stutters for the 3080. But we saw in most other games before, the performance is very low anyway. We could perhaps maintain an average of 30 or 40 FPS with more VRAM, but I think that most players would aim for at least 60 FPS average by lowering the settings even more. Same at 1440p. On the vast majority of the test, it goes well, except for the hallway at the end of the run where the performances collapses. But this spot is often problematic, especially with ray tracing on. I want to blame VRAM here, but I wouldn't bet on it either. It will not struggle the same way on each run, so it's a bit weird. And with DLSS, overall, it works better at 4K or 1440p, even if on this run I still had a nice drop in the hallway at the end at 1440p, but not at 4K. So yeah, this game still behaves quite strangely at times. So overall, for Hogwarts Legacy, we are on the edge VRAM-wise. At 4K Ultra with ray tracing, 10 gigs isn't enough. Now the question is, do we really want to play with ray tracing anyway in this title? Personally, I found RT mode uglier than raster in this game, and worse, it makes the performance of the game even more unstable than it already is without. But yeah, at 4K RT, once again, you have to lower settings to get to 60 FPS average, but if you will be fine with 30 FPS average, then yeah, a card with more VRAM wouldn't have some of the issues the 3080 does. Horizon Forbidden West now, so in very high preset, it's really heavy, 76 FPS average at 1440p, 34 at 4K, but the performance is very stable, no VRAM issues here. Even if we know that the very high preset can be an issue with 8 gigs card, so 10 GB should be enough, but that doesn't mean that sometimes it couldn't be a problem in some spots in the game. With DLSS, the game is performing better, but it's still super demanding. At 1440p we go from 76 to 94 FPS on average, and at 4K from 34 to 48, so we are still not reaching 60 FPS on average. And to get there, high details instead of very high, we go from 48 to 72 FPS on average. That's more than 50% more performance just by going from very high to high details, which is insane. Especially as is often the case, the difference between the two presets is quite slim. The game remains absolutely gorgeous. Jedi Survivor, another demanding game. Optimization is not great, but spoiler alert, this one never really had any VRAM issues, so well, no problems on that side for the 3080. That doesn't stop the game from stuttering regularly, but that's on Unreal Engine 4, and bad optimization, just like with Hogwarts Legacy. Ray tracing is not very demanding on this title, but it does not change much either visually wise. It's a light implementation, therefore kind of pointless. The performance drops a little bit, but it doesn't get stuck because of VRAM levels here. With DLSS we improve the performance level, even if yes, it remains unstable at times, but playable, and a bit like with Hogwarts Legacy, these performance issues will probably never be fixed, which is kind of sad. We move on to an Unreal Engine 5 game with Lords of the Fallen, which is patched very regularly, but it remains a pretty demanding game, particularly at ultra settings. It is difficult to reach 60 FPS on average at 1440p and 40 at 4K, but no worries on the VRAM side, so it's a pretty low usage even, I would say. And if we go to high details, we gain around 20% at 1440p and 4K, and that's not enough to reach 60 FPS average at 4K, unfortunately, and at 1440p, no performance issue here. With upscaling though, even at ultra, we see massive performance gain, since it is more than 40% gains at 1440p and 80% at 4K for DLSS balanced. I mean, it's a more aggressive upscale than DLSS quality at 1440p, but still, the game scales enormously with upscaling, but this is the case with a lot of Unreal Engine 5 games, which isn't very surprising given that the engine is designed with upscaling in mind. Ratchet Clank now, so it's always an interesting game to observe, since it's still one of the only titles that use direct storage. We know that it's a game that really likes memory bandwidth and VRAM as well. And with very high preset at 1440p and 4K, performance are fine, but we can see that often there are small drops on the 1%, so the game probably would like a little more VRAM, and we find regular micro stutters too, so the game compensates for its lack of VRAM how it can. And if we go to high settings, well, as often the problem disappears, there is still a fairly large delta between 1% and average, but it's not really a VRAM thing here. It's more of a recurring issue on this title with the GeForce. The regions are less impacted, but well, even at 4K, performance are alright here. With ray tracing now at very high settings, well, it's a different story. At 4K we are under 30 FPS average, and at 1440p we don't reach 60. Without upscaling it's rough, but we don't have a slideshow or stutter fest, like on some other games. And with DLSS it goes better at 1440p and 4K, but it's still very difficult, but no big surprise here. It's like that in a lot of games with ray tracing anyway. If we go to high details here, well, we still don't reach the 60 FPS average at 4K, but at 1440p it allows the 1% to be a good notch above. So yes, the game would like more VRAM, but the way it shows it is different from some other titles. It will not necessarily have big stutters, but the performance will not be as good as if the card had more VRAM. And we know this because we have already seen this behavior when comparing the 4060 Ti 8 gigs and 16 gigs. But clearly, with the 3080, I would rather play without ray tracing here, just to have more stable performances. Resident Evil 4, another title which had a couple of issues upon release, particularly with ray tracing, since when it was activated and there was a lack of VRAM, the game just crashed, which was very bad, but that's been fixed since then. And on the highest settings without RT, it works without any particular problem for the 3080, even if yes, we know that we can saturate the VRAM by setting all the sliders to the max. With the max RT preset at times, the game stutters at 1440p as well as at 4K, so here we have a VRAM issue. If you see some error message on the capture from time to time, it's the capture card that was doing weird stuff then, no idea why, it didn't like Resident Evil 4 at that moment. But anyway, clearly, we are not comfortable VRAM-wise in this title with ray tracing activated, and the performances will dip and stutter here and there, so it's better not to use ray tracing since it contributes almost nothing to the title anyway, like many other games. And with FSR, it behaves the same as when it wasn't on, the stutters are still there, we just have a bit more FPS, so not much point activating it either, just run the game without RT. Getting back to Unreal Engine 5 with Remnant 2, which is also patched very regularly and at ultra native. Performances are alright at 1440p and at 4K, it's a little tough, but we have seen worse. An issue with this game is that the basic TAA of the game is quite bad, particularly when the performance is quite low, so at 4K here, we see a lot of artifacting and ghosting, which is not really pleasant. I much prefer the rendering with DLSS or XeSS in this title. Most often, it brings out a cleaner image than the base TAA. FSR is really bad quality-wise in this game, so I don't recommend it at all. And as we saw earlier with Lords of the Fallen, activating upscaling also brings a lot of performances here, almost 40% for DLSS quality at 1440p, and almost 80% for DLSS balanced at 4K, and upscaling is a win-win in terms of performance and visuals to me in the game. Spiderman Miles Morales now, so it's an interesting one since at its core it's the same engine as Ratchet Clank, but it doesn't behave exactly the same. At very high native settings in 1440p, no issues here, very good performances overall, even if like on Ratchet the 1% are rather low, but it's an issue with this engine and GeForce cards, I guess. At 4K though, on this run it was fine in terms of performance, but on another run it was not the case, since as we will see here, in the same conditions, I had a huge slowdown, and that reminded me a bit of what we saw earlier with Hogwarts Legacy in the hallway of performance drops. I strongly suspect it's being a VRAM issue, but by doing several runs, restarting the title and so on, it didn't do it again for me. So I would say we are kinda at the limit VRAM-wise here, so clearly I think it's better to move on to high preset rather than very high. With ray tracing on at 4K, the game slows down all the time, and here we clearly are in need of more VRAM. At 1440p, the performances are also fluctuating a bit, too much for my taste to have something pleasant gameplay-wise. And with DLSS at 1440p, it goes much better. It's generally smooth, it's very playable, and we shouldn't encounter many problems. At 4K though, it remains complicated, even if it's much better than what we had without upscaling, but we will find another big slowdown at the end of this run, like we saw in native resolution, so it will be better to lower the details to high settings in this game to avoid those issues. Another problematic game, The Last of Us Part 1, we know that with 8 gigs cards at ultra settings it's not usable, and with 10 gigs, well, it depends on the situations. At 1440p, it's okay, even if we observe some small regular hiccups, which tell us that we are borderline VRAM-wise, and it's the same thing at 4K as well. It's usable, but not ideal, and on top of that, at 4K, we get around 38 FPS average. It's not exactly stellar performances. And by activating DLSS at ultra settings, we see better performances, but we still find this slight constant hiccups. Some people may not even see or notice them, but personally, I feel them, and it will annoy me very quickly playing like this. So the VRAM does not completely saturate, but we are really close to issues. So as is often the case, if we go to the high preset, the problem completely disappears at 1440p, but at 4K, they are still kind of there, the small hiccups, but they are less regular than at ultra settings. But as we saw in a lot of other games, performance-wise, we still aren't at the 60 FPS average mark, so we will need to drop the settings some more to get there. And if we activate DLSS, we now reach an average of 80 FPS, the performance is much more stable. Image quality, it doesn't exactly change anything significant either, no question asked for me, that's how I will run this game on a 4K display. And finally, we end with Yakuza Like a Dragon Infinite Wells, and no issues whatsoever with VRAM, no stutters, but still a pretty heavy game, particularly at 4K, since at 1440p. Game run really well, but I like testing Yakuza games because it's an in-house engine from Sega, and also just because I really like the Yakuza series. But well, yeah, at 4K we would probably want some more performances, and if we activate DLSS, it's going much better. At 1440p, you don't need upscaling per se, but personally, I prefer the rendering of DLSS to the game's GAA, so GLAA must also work fine, but the DLSS quality is clean enough here. And at 4K, with DLSS balanced, it's all good, no more performance concerns, and we are now around 100 FPS on average, and the game still looks great. So, on the dozen of games tested here with the 3080, do we run into many VRAM issues? Well, there is some games where the 10 gigs are still plenty enough, on some others we seem borderline, but not real issues, and on some games we are really too borderline, and it shows. Some games works fine at 1440p, but not at 4K. But as we have also seen on several occasions, most of the times when 10 gigs isn't enough, it's often at 4K ultra settings with ray tracing, and the performance is in any case very bad, so VRAM or not, we have to lower settings anyway. Use upscaling or both to get decent performances. And cards that offer similar performance level at 4K with more VRAM, like the 68 or 7800 XT or even the 4070, also need to have their settings adjusted in most of those games to get a good frame rate despite having more VRAM. But that doesn't mean that this is the case in every game. On The Last of Us or Ratchet Clank, for example, having even 12 gigs of VRAM would allow for smooth gameplay at ultra settings while being very playable at 4K, and even at 1440p, it would allow us to have more stable performances when we are getting too close to the VRAM limit with 10 gigs of VRAM. But still, clearly, 10 gigs of VRAM is overall less problematic than 8 on some of the games we saw today, where 8 gigs cards struggle much more than the 3080 does. But yeah, obviously, we would have liked to at least get 12 gigs of VRAM for the 3080 from the get-go. With 10 gigs, we are in a sort of middle ground between 8 and 12, which is not always on the winning end, as we saw today. And yes, I know there is a 3080 12 gigs, but that came up much later, and if you have one of those, that's great, but it's not the topic of this video. Does that mean that the 3080 10 gigs is rubbish, that it's unusable and that you should throw it in the trash, or not buy it if you find one at a good price on the second-hand market, because you heard that in about 2 years it won't run games anymore? Clearly, no. For me, it remains a completely viable choice if you are aware of the strong points and weaknesses of this card. If you are the type of player who want to play all your games at ultra native only all the time, then no, this card will not be a good choice for you, and you are better off avoiding it. But in any case, this level of performances is not really great at 4K without adjusting settings in most recent demanding games, even to get just a constant 60 FPS average. And with ray tracing, it's a bit the same. It can be used in certain cases, but it will not be without making concessions and adjustments in the most demanding games. But as we saw today, if you understand that playing at high details rather than ultra changes almost nothing aside of killing performances, that DLSS at 4K works really well, and that you are just aiming for a 4K 60 high settings with upscaling, the card still does the job really well, in fact. And I admit that I always have trouble with this fixation that many players have with ultra settings. As we have seen today, there are games where we gain 30 to 40% more performances just going from ultra to high details, which is absolutely insane given the very few differences visually speaking. This is also why I do most of my tests with high details, because ultra is often just a good way to get yourself to spend more money than it's worth to get a good gaming experience. I know not everyone will think or feel the same way, and that's fine, but I think that the demands of PC players on certain aspects like ultra settings or bust are leaning more toward psychological issues than anything else, or just looking for excuses to buy new hardware when it's clearly not always necessary. I mean, most people would be unable to see any difference between high or ultra settings or upscaling on or off on a side-by-side comparison. But I get it. If for you it's ultra native or nothing, more power to you. It's your money and you do what you want with it. It doesn't matter to me. I bought enough hardware for fun without really needing to upgrade. I totally understand. It's just the looking for an excuse to do so that's kind of amusing to me. So, for me, the 3080 is still a good card, and it remains totally competitive with the actual 7800 XT or 4070. And to make a viable upgrade from a 3080, you would have to aim for at least a 4080 or 7900 XTX, and given that the next generation is likely in about 6 months, and the actual price of this card, it's clearly not a good time to upgrade in my opinion. I mean, you can still play everything with a 3080 until the next generation of cards, or even the next one, particularly at 1440p or 1080p. At 4K, it's more difficult, but with upscaling, it remains super clean visually and it runs quite well. And I think that it will be the case until the next generation of consoles, which won't be there for a couple years. So yes, some of the comments I saw still don't make much sense to me. Even with its 10 gigs of VRAM, the 3080 remains a very solid card, and I don't really see why games would suddenly require a lot more VRAM than those released recently. As I have said many times before in some other videos, until the next generation of consoles, why would games suddenly require a lot more VRAM? What made 8 gigs card become insufficient was the PS5 and Xbox Series games, just like the PS4 and Xbox One generation made 4 gigs of VRAM inadequate. And until the next generation of consoles, which will also have a correction period, I don't really see what would radically change from the games released recently. Maybe I am wrong, but for me, what we saw today is what we are likely to see for several years for the 3080. You sometimes will have to adjust the settings, but the games will still run properly in the end, while still being very clean visually speaking, even if, yeah, not at ultra settings each time. So, in short, should Nvidia have put more than 10 gigs of VRAM on the 3080? Yes, clearly it would have been better. But unfortunately, that's not what we got for several reasons, as we saw at the beginning of the video, and that's a shame. But I don't think that buyers were scammed buying the 3080 in 2020. The overall proposition was really good for what it was supposed to cost. Those who paid $2,000 for it, on the other hand, well, that's another issue. But the card is getting close to 4 years old now. Is it really that surprising or outrageous that it doesn't run the latest games at 4K native ultra ray tracing at 60 FPS? I think it's a pretty normal situation. The consoles clearly don't do that either, and even the 4080 and 7900 XTX don't do it right now in those games. And when they will be as old as the 3080 now, they will be struggling even more too. So in short, no need to throw your 3080 in the trash. It will still run all the games for many years to come, just as much as the 4070 and 7800 XT will. But no, it won't always be at ultra settings. Is that such a huge deal? Well, that's entirely up to you. I find that ultra is often ridiculous given the hardware visual cost ratio compared to high or medium settings, but if pushing all the sliders to max gives you a particular kind of pleasure, well, that's not a card for you. But personally, I'm more of the type to log the FPS and play with high settings, and also trying out DLSS in games to see if I like how it looks or not. It saves on power and offers a more stable experience in the end most of the time. But anyway, that's it for me. As usual, if you enjoyed the video and want to give strength to the channel, the usual YouTube stuff, and there is also my Ko-fi page if you want to support me directly. It helps me a lot, and a huge thanks to all the supporters. And see you in the next video. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Bye.